The night was thick with fog, heavy and suffocating, the kind of fog that seemed to swallow the very air you breathed. It clung to the windows of a small, isolated house perched at the edge of a forest, as if trying to keep something inside, or perhaps keep something out. Inside, a woman named Lena sat in silence, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of an old, weathered photograph. The picture had been taken decades ago, showing a younger version of herself with a man she no longer recognized. Her heart skipped a beat as the edges of the photograph began to warp in her hand, as though it was slowly dissolving into something darker. She shook her head, trying to shake off the dread crawling up her spine. There was something off about this house, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She had come here to escape, to find solace after the tragedy that had unfolded in her life. But ever since she stepped through the door, strange things had begun to happen. The air felt heavier, the shadows longer, and the silence. It wasn't comforting, not like she'd hoped. It was oppressive. Lena had found the house through a listing online, a secluded retreat for someone seeking peace, far away from the chaos of the world. But it felt like the world was still very much with her. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the walls seemed like whispers from the past. There were moments when she thought she could hear her. The storm raged outside, an unrelenting downpour that battered against the windows with such force that it felt as if the house itself might collapse beneath the weight of the rain. Inside, the air was thick, damp, and musty, as though the walls had soaked up years of forgotten sorrow. Lena and Tom stood in the dimly lit foyer of their new home, trying to shake off the unease that lingered in the very bones of the house. The paint on the walls had long since chipped away, revealing the faded remnants of another time, and the floorboards creaked beneath their every step. Lena, glancing nervously around, couldn't help but feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on her. The realtor had been vague, almost too eager to unload it. It was an old house, yes, but there had been a reason it had been empty for so long. Several families had come and gone over the years, but none had stayed. The previous owners, they'd all disappeared mysteriously, one by one, and there were rumors that the house had something to do with their vanishing. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unsettling thoughts. This was their fresh start, their escape from the city, the chaos, the noise. She and Tom had dreamed of a peaceful life in the countryside. But here, now, in this old house, something didn't feel right. The air was too heavy, the house too silent, too aware of them. Tom, on the other hand, was in a different state of mind. He was eager, excited even. This was going to be their home, their sanctuary. He was focused on unpacking the boxes, excited to start this new chapter of their lives. "Lena, come on," he called out, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence. "Stop worrying, it's just a storm. The house is old, sure, but nothing more than that." Lena forced a smile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she turned to grab another box, the faintest whisper floated to her ears. It was so soft, so distant, that at first she thought it was just the wind. But no, this was different. The sound was almost human, a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the wall across the room, her breath catching in her throat. Tom didn't notice. He was too busy sorting through the boxes, pulling out kitchen utensils, and humming to himself. "You're overthinking it," he said casually, glancing up from his task. The house is just settling. Happens all the time. But Lena wasn't convinced. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the box in front of her, but her eyes never left the spot where she had heard the sound. The walls seemed to hum, an eerie vibration that made her skin crawl. The whispering continued, growing softer, fading into the relentless howl of the storm outside, but still lingering in the background, just out of reach. The oppressive atmosphere in the house only grew thicker with every passing minute. The old wood groaned in response to the storm, but there was something about the creaking that felt deliberate, unnatural. Lena wanted to ask Tom if he heard it too, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but deep down she knew that there was something here, something that had been here long before they arrived. Tom. Lena's voice was barely a whisper, her eyes darting nervously toward the dark corners of the room. Do you ever feel like we're not alone? Tom paused, his hands stilling mid-air as he unpacked. He looked at her with that amused, reassuring smile that had always been a part of him. What, you mean besides me? Lena, you're starting to sound like those people we used to watch on those ghost shows. It's just an old house, okay? Let's focus on getting settled. But Lena wasn't so sure. She glanced over her shoulder toward the staircase, the shadows pooling in the corners of the upper hallway, casting strange shapes on the walls. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw something move in the darkness. A figure. No, it was just the rain, playing tricks on her eyes. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave her. It clung to her, suffocating, whispering to her that she wasn't safe here. This house, this place, held something dark in its past. And as the rain poured down harder and the wind howled louder, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for them, waiting for someone to move in, to trigger the next chapter in its long and twisted history. The whispering stopped, but the unease remained. Something was watching, something ancient and unseen, lurking in the shadows of the walls, just beyond reach. Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the house was pressing in on her, as if the walls themselves were closing around her. And yet, she couldn't quite explain why. After that strange whispering sound earlier, she found herself wandering through the old house, unable to stay still. Something was drawing her deeper into its history, like a magnet pulling her toward a truth that she wasn't sure she wanted to face. It was the basement that called to her next. The basement door creaked open, the scent of mildew and dampness overwhelming. A musty, earthy smell filled her lungs as she descended the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The dim light from the lone bulb above flickered intermittently, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was here, deep in the bowels of the house, that Lena felt the pulse of something ancient, something alive. She ran her hand along the walls, her fingers tracing the cracks and imperfections, when something odd caught her eye. A small section of the wall, a panel that seemed out of place, slightly askew. Curiosity overcame her, and with little effort, she pried the panel loose. It came away with a dull scrape, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside, wrapped in brittle leather, was an old, faded diary. Her breath caught in her throat as she carefully pulled it out, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the yellowing pages almost crumbling beneath her touch. She could barely make out the words on the first page, but one name stood out. Isabella. Isabella. The name lingered in her mind as she flipped through the diary, her fingers trembling with each new page. The entries were filled with longing, sorrow, and unease, fragments of a life lived in this very house. But as she neared the final page, her stomach twisted with dread. The last entry was chilling, written in a hurried, desperate hand. "They are watching from behind the walls." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't breathe for a moment. She read the words again, slower this time, as if trying to convince herself that it was just a haunting echo from the past. But deep down, she knew that this message, this warning, was something more. Isabella's words felt alive, like a whisper that was meant for her, from long ago, warning her of something still lurking in the house. Shaken, Lena began to research Isabella's life. She spent hours digging through old town records, searching for any hint of what had happened to her. It didn't take long to uncover the tragedy that had struck the house. Isabella's family had vanished under mysterious circumstances in the late 1800s. No one had ever found out what happened to them, and the town had whispered about the house being cursed, abandoned for decades after their disappearance. The details were scarce, but the rumors were thick, the sense of something unspeakable lurking in the house undeniable. That night, as the storm raged again, Lena tried to push the unease aside, but the house refused to let her forget. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but it was the noises from within the walls that kept her awake. Soft, almost imperceptible knocks, like someone tapping from the other side. A quick knock, then silence. Another tap, and then whispers. They were faint, so faint she wasn't sure if she was imagining of them. The sound seemed to come from every direction, surrounding her, echoing through the hollow bones of the house. Lena sat up in bed, heart racing, eyes darting around the dark room. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, the silence broken only by the steady, rhythmic knocks. Was she going crazy? Was this just the house settling like Tom kept saying? Or was there something, someone, inside the walls? Tom slept soundly beside her, unaware of the growing unease that gripped her. She wanted to wake him, but part of her feared he would dismiss her, laugh it off as just another overactive imagination. So instead, she lay there, wide-eyed, listening, waiting, the whispers crawling beneath her skin. The next morning, she couldn't ignore it any longer. Things in the house were changing, shifting. Objects weren't where she had left them. A chair had been moved across the room, its legs scratching loudly against the floor, even though she knew she hadn't touched it. The kitchen utensils were out of place, as if someone had used them in the night, but there was no sign of anyone else. Tom, ever the skeptic, insisted it was nothing more than the house settling. But the house wasn't settling in a way that made sense. The creaks, the knocks, the whispers, they were more than that. They were deliberate. Lena found herself drawn back to the basement, unable to ignore the growing sense of dread. Every time she descended those stairs, the feeling intensified. It was as if the house was breathing, living, pulsating with something unseen, something that couldn't be explained. The sounds in the basement were the loudest, reverberating through the concrete and stone, as if whatever was in the walls had a mind of its own, aware of her presence. It was here, in the heart of the house, that she began to feel truly watched. Every glance over her shoulder made her shiver. Every rustle of the air felt like a whisper just behind her ear. By the second night, the house's presence had become undeniable. Lena had started to believe that whatever Isabella had felt, whatever she had been trying to warn her about, was real. There was something in the walls, something waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to let them leave. As the days dragged on, the house's hold on Lena grew tighter. The whispers had intensified, weaving their way through her thoughts, drawing her deeper into its web. Sleep had become elusive, and even when she did manage to close her eyes, it was never without a sense of dread. That night, as the storm raged outside, Lena lay in bed, her body tense, her mind spinning with thoughts of Isabella and the secrets the house had kept for so long. But then, just as she drifted into a restless sleep, the dreams began. The dreams were vivid, haunting. She found herself standing in the dimly lit hallway of the house, but everything was wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, alive, and the air was thick with a suffocating sense of despair. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. It was Isabella. The woman's lips trembled as she reached out, her voice a rasping whisper. "Help me," she pleaded, her words echoing in the darkness. "They're behind the walls. I can't escape. Please help me." Lena reached for her, but before she could make contact, Isabella screamed, her mouth opening wide, a sound of pure agony. And then everything went dark. Lena awoke with a start, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was cold, and for a split second, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. But then, she heard it. The sound of someone crying, low, mournful sobs that seemed to come from within the very walls of the house. It was as if the dream had followed her back into the waking world. She sat up, staring at the walls in horror as the sobs grew louder and more frantic. The cry of a woman trapped, begging for release. Lena's breath hitched. The connection between the dream and the sounds of the house was undeniable. Isabella's spirit wasn't just haunting her dreams, it was reaching out to her, trying to communicate from beyond the grave. She couldn't ignore it any longer. Compelled by an instinct she didn't understand, Lena found herself drawn to the basement once again. The whispers had grown louder in the last few days, louder, more distinct, like a chorus of voices, desperate, pleading. The hairs on her neck stood up as she descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement felt different now, as if it were no longer just a storage space, but something far darker. Something that had been waiting for her. It was then, as Lena moved to the far corner of the room, that she noticed it. An old wooden door hidden behind a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The door was unlike any she had seen in the house before. It didn't belong. There was something ancient about it. A door that had been sealed away for reasons unknown. The whispers emanated from behind it, louder now, almost deafening. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. It creaked and groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths of the house. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay, and as she stepped forward, she could feel the very walls closing in on her, pressing against her with a sense of suffocating malice. The whispers were now full sentences, fragmented but clear enough to make Lena's blood run cold. "We are waiting. You are not alone. Help her. She is still here." Lena's heart raced as she stepped deeper into the corridor, the air growing colder still. It was like the house was alive, like it was breathing with her, its pulse quickening with each step she took. The whispers seemed to grow louder the further she went, but it wasn't just the voices now. It was a presence, something that felt as though it were right beside her, brushing against her skin. And then, as if the darkness itself was trying to pull her deeper, Lena stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. A book, The pages were old, yellowed with age, but the symbols etched into the leather cover were unmistakable. Arcane, forbidden. She could feel the weight of it in her hands, the power that radiated from it, as though it were alive, beckoning her closer. With trembling hands, Lena opened the book. The text was hard to read, ancient words scrawled in a language that felt foreign, yet familiar. As she translated the symbols, her stomach twisted in horror. The book detailed a ritual, a dark and forbidden practice, meant to summon an entity from beyond the veil, a powerful force that could grant its summoner unimaginable power in exchange for a terrible price. Isabella had been obsessed with this ritual, the pages told her. Desperate to save her family from a deadly curse that had been placed upon them, she had attempted to summon the entity. But something had gone terribly wrong. The ritual had backfired, trapping not only Isabella's spirit, but the entity itself within the walls of the house. It was no longer just a haunting. The entity had become part of the house, part of the very foundation, feeding off the sorrow and despair of the souls trapped within. And now it was trying to break free. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a physical blow. The whispers were no longer just words, they were commands, desperate cries from Isabella and the entity. They were warning her, begging her to understand. The entity was no longer contained. It had been stirring, growing stronger, and now it was waiting for the right moment to escape. The walls were alive with the sound of scratching, clawing, like something was trying to tear through from the other side. The whispers reached a fever pitch, louder, more urgent. And then, through the roar of the voices, one sentence stood out clear and cold. "Help me, before it's too late." Lena turned to run, her legs shaking beneath her. But as she reached the doorway, the house seemed to close in on her. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and for the first time since arriving, Lena realized just how truly trapped she was. Whatever Isabella had unleashed, whatever had been bound within these walls, it was coming for her. The nights in the house had become unbearable. The air grew colder, thicker, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Lena had tried to ignore it, tried to push it down, but the truth could no longer be denied. The entity was real, and it was growing stronger, its presence pressing in on her from every angle. She could feel it, even in the pit of her stomach, the way it twisted and turned in the dark corners of her mind. It was watching her, waiting for something, waiting for them. Tom had begun to notice the strange things too, though he was still reluctant to accept the full truth of what was happening. He'd been seeing things, shadows that moved, flickering at the edges of his vision. At first, he chalked it up to the stress of the move, the heavy weight of the house settling around them. But the more it happened, the harder it was to deny. One night, as they sat together in the living room, the temperature dropped suddenly, a chill creeping into the room as though the house itself had exhaled a frigid breath. Tom glanced around uneasily, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of something at the top of the stairs, just a figure standing motionless in the shadows. Lena. His voice trembled, a crack in the calm he had so desperately tried to maintain. "Did you see that?" Lena turned to follow his gaze, her heart sinking, as she saw nothing but the darkness of the hallway, the stairs leading up into the abyss of the house. "It's nothing," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. "It's just the shadows." But even as she spoke, she knew she was lying. The shadows weren't just shadows anymore. Something was there, something that moved when it shouldn't, something that had crossed the line between the living and the dead. That night, as they lay in bed, Tom turned to her, his face pale in the dim light. "Lena, we need to leave. Something's not right here. We can't just keep ignoring it." Lena shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Tom, we can't. You don't understand." Her voice faltered as she gathered the courage to speak the truth. "I found something. A diary. Isabella's diary." She told him everything about Isabella, the family, the curse, and the ritual. How the entity had been bound within the walls by Isabella's desperate attempt to save her family from the curse, but how it had gone horribly wrong, trapping not just Isabella, but the malevolent force she had summoned, deep inside the house. Tom stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. "This sounds insane, Lena. You're telling me that this house, this old place, is haunted by some kind of dark entity? That we've been living in a house that's cursed?" Lena nodded, her voice trembling. "I don't know how else to explain it, but we can't leave until we stop it. We have to finish what Isabella started." The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Tom, after a long silence, finally nodded. "Okay," he said, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "Let's find out the truth. Together." The next day they scoured the house, hoping to find something that could help them. It was in the attic, buried under years of dust and forgotten memories, that they found the book, the one that detailed the ritual Isabella had attempted. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but it was clear enough to understand the basic steps of the ritual. A binding spell that would require a powerful sacrifice, something deeply personal to the one performing it. The house groaned around them as they read, the walls seeming to vibrate with the energy of something that had been waiting for this moment. The temperature dropped further, and the very air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. As they prepared to perform the ritual, Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the presence of the entity closing in, like a dark cloud surrounding them, a feeling of malice that seeped into the bones of the house. She knew it was watching them, waiting for them to fail. "Do you feel that?" Lena whispered, her voice shaky as the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "It's here." Tom stepped back, his face contorting with fear. "This is insane, Lena. We can't do this. We should just leave while we still can." But Lena shook her head, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. "I can't leave. Not after everything I've seen. Isabella's spirit is trapped here. The entity is too strong. It's not just a haunting anymore. It's real. If we don't do this, we'll be its next victims." The house groaned louder, the windows rattling in their frames. Objects began to move on their own, flying off shelves, smashing to the floor as though thrown by an unseen hand. The walls seemed to pulse, the temperature plummeting, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers were now full sentences, echoing through the house, calling out their names, promising that they would never leave. "Lena!" The entity's voice was a guttural rasp, cold and malevolent. "You cannot stop me. You will never leave." The house seemed to close in on them, the walls bending, twisting, as if they were alive, shifting in response to the growing fury of the entity. Tom was frozen, his breath shallow as he backed away from the ritual circle. "We need to leave now. It's too late. We can't fight this thing." Lena, trembling but resolute, stepped forward. "I won't let it win. I have to do this." She had seen the visions of Isabella, heard her pleas for help. She couldn't leave her to suffer forever. She couldn't leave the house to consume more souls. The ritual required a sacrifice, something that would bind them to the house, something deeply personal, a blood offering to ensure the entity would be trapped once again. Lena's hand trembled as she drew a knife across her palm, the blood pooling in her hand. She held it high, her heart hammering in her chest. Just as the entity lunged forward, a dark, twisted figure made of shadow and malice, Lena closed her eyes and pressed her bleeding hand to the floor. The house shook violently, the walls groaning with fury as the entity howled in rage. The shadows reached for her, desperate to stop the ritual, but Lena held firm. With a final cry, she whispered the binding words, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was doing. The house screamed. For a moment, everything was chaos, furniture flying, the walls cracking, the very foundation of the house shaking as the entity fought against the ritual. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the house fell silent. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The air grew still. Lena opened her eyes. The entity was gone. The house, once alive with the sound of torment, was now eerily silent. The walls, which had once groaned with unseen voices, now stood still, unmoving. The malevolent force that had haunted the house was no more, sealed away once again. But the cost had been high. Lena collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from the exhaustion of the ordeal. Tom rushed to her side, his face pale but relieved. I found something. A diary. Isabella's diary. She told him everything about Isabella, the family, the curse, and the ritual. How the entity had been bound within the walls by Isabella's desperate attempt to save her family from the curse, but how it had gone horribly wrong, trapping not just Isabella, but the malevolent force she had summoned, deep inside the house. Tom stared at her, disbelief written all over his face. This sounds insane, Lena. You're telling me that this house, this old place, is haunted by some kind of dark entity? That we've been living in a house that's cursed? Lena nodded, her voice trembling. I don't know how else to explain it, but we can't leave until we stop it. We have to finish what Isabella started. The weight of her words hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Tom, after a long silence, finally nodded. Okay, he said, though doubt lingered in his eyes. Let's find out the truth. Together. The next day they scoured the house, hoping to find something that could help them. It was in the attic, buried under years of dust and forgotten memories, that they found the book, the one that detailed the ritual Isabella had attempted. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but it was clear enough to understand the basic steps of the ritual. A binding spell that would require a powerful sacrifice, something deeply personal to the one performing it. The house groaned around them as they read, the walls seeming to vibrate with the energy of something that had been waiting for this moment. The temperature dropped further, and the very air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. As they prepared to perform the ritual, Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She felt the presence of the entity closing in, like a dark cloud surrounding them, a feeling of malice that seeped into the bones of the house. She knew it was watching them, waiting for them to fail. "Do you feel that?" Lena whispered, her voice shaky as the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "It's here." Tom stepped back, his face contorting with fear. "This is insane, Lena. We can't do this. We should just leave while we still can." But Lena shook her head, her eyes wild with a mix of fear and determination. "I can't leave. Not after everything I've seen. Isabella's spirit is trapped here. The entity is too strong. It's not just a haunting anymore. It's real. If we don't do this, we'll be its next victims." The house groaned louder, the windows rattling in their frames. Objects began to move on their own, flying off shelves, smashing to the floor as though thrown by an unseen hand. The walls seemed to pulse, the temperature plummeting, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers were now full sentences, echoing through the house, calling out their names, promising that they would never leave. "Lena!" The entity's voice was a guttural rasp, cold and malevolent. "You cannot stop me. You will never leave." The house seemed to close in on them, the walls bending, twisting, as if they were alive, shifting in response to the growing fury of the entity. Tom was frozen, his breath shallow as he backed away from the ritual circle. "We need to leave now. It's too late. We can't fight this thing." Lena, trembling but resolute, stepped forward. "I won't let it win. I have to do this." She had seen the visions of Isabella, heard her pleas for help. She couldn't leave her to suffer forever. She couldn't leave the house to consume more souls. The ritual required a sacrifice, something that would bind them to the house, something deeply personal, a blood offering to ensure the entity would be trapped once again. Lena's hand trembled as she drew a knife across her palm, the blood pooling in her hand. She held it high, her heart hammering in her chest. Just as the entity lunged forward, a dark, twisted figure made of shadow and malice, Lena closed her eyes and pressed her bleeding hand to the floor. The house shook violently, the walls groaning with fury as the entity howled in rage. The shadows reached for her, desperate to stop the ritual, but Lena held firm. With a final cry, she whispered the binding words, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was doing. The house screamed. For a moment, everything was chaos, furniture flying, the walls cracking, the very foundation of the house shaking as the entity fought against the ritual. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the house fell silent. The temperature slowly returned to normal. The air grew still. Lena opened her eyes. The entity was gone. The house, once alive with the sound of torment, was now eerily silent. The walls, which had once groaned with unseen voices, now stood still, unmoving. The malevolent force that had haunted the house was no more, sealed away once again. But the cost had been high. Lena collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from the exhaustion of the ordeal. Tom rushed to her side, his face pale but relieved. "We did it," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's over." The house was silent. The walls, once filled with whispers, now stood mute. But Lena knew that the house was never truly empty. It had been a vessel, a prison for something far darker than they could ever understand. And as they stood there, in the aftermath of their confrontation, they realized that they had narrowly escaped the same fate as the others before them. But the house remained, its story unfinished, its darkness still lingering in the quiet corners of the world. The house was quiet now. For the first time since Lena and Tom had moved in, the oppressive weight that had pressed on them seemed to have lifted. The air no longer felt thick with the malevolent presence of the entity. The whispers, once a constant echo that wrapped itself around their thoughts, were gone. There was only the stillness of the house, the silence of something that had been sealed away, buried in the walls once more. It was over. At least, that's what they told themselves. Tom sat on the couch, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, leaving behind a shell of the man who had once been skeptical, dismissing the strange occurrences as tricks of the mind. He had seen things now, things that he couldn't explain, things that had shattered his reality in ways he hadn't thought possible. Beside him, Lena sat silently, her hands trembling as she packed the last of their belongings into boxes. The house, once a dream of a new beginning, was now just a nightmare they both wanted to forget. But even as they prepared to leave, they knew they couldn't outrun what they had experienced. The house had changed them. The darkness they had faced had left scars that would never heal. The images of Isabella's ghost, the screams, the shadows, it all played on a loop in their minds, replaying over and over, as if the house had etched those memories into their very souls. There was no escaping it. Not really. Lena moved slowly through the house, collecting the final remnants of their life there. It had been an exhausting few days, but the weight of it all was starting to settle. She felt a strange calm, a finality, as if they were closing the door on something that had consumed them. The air in the house felt lighter now, almost empty. And yet, as she moved through the rooms, a sense of unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. It was in the quiet of the attic that she found it. Isabella's diary. Lena had thought she had destroyed it long ago, or at least locked it away. But there it was, sitting on the dusty floor, open as if it had been waiting for her. Her heart raced as she approached it, the familiar weight of dread settling in her chest. She picked it up, flipping through the pages, searching for any answers, anything that might explain what had happened. But as she reached the end of the book, her breath caught in her throat. There was a new entry. It was dated after their victory, after the ritual, after the entity had been sealed back into the walls. It was written in her handwriting. They are watching from behind the walls. The words burned into her mind as she read them over and over, disbelief crashing over her. She couldn't understand. It didn't make sense. The house was supposed to be free. They had sealed it. They had won. So why were these words here? Why had the diary continued on its own, as if it had a life of its own, continuing the cycle? A cold chill ran down Lena's spine as she felt something shift in the air around her. The walls, once silent, seemed to crick. She looked around, her pulse quickening, but there was nothing there. The house was empty, silent. The shadows no longer stirred, but in the pit of her stomach, she knew something was still here. She turned the page, desperately hoping for some explanation, but there was nothing more. The diary was empty. Tom's voice broke through the silence, his footsteps echoing up the stairs. "Lena, what's wrong? What did you find?" Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide, terror rising in her chest. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The house, it's still watching us." Tom stepped into the room, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He looked at the diary, his gaze lingering on the entry Lena had just read. His expression faltered, a flicker of fear crossing his features before he quickly tried to dismiss it. "You're not serious," he said, forcing a laugh. But it was hollow, the laugh of someone trying to convince themselves that the nightmare was truly behind them. "We're leaving, Lena. It's over." But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. She couldn't ignore the words, the chilling message that seemed to be written just for her. It felt as if the house was still alive, its presence still lingering in the very walls, waiting, watching. Perhaps it had never truly left. Maybe it had only been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. As the two of them stood in the empty attic, a strange, oppressive silence fell over them, heavy and suffocating. The house had given them no answers, only more questions. And with every passing second, Lena felt the walls closing in around her once more, the feeling of being watched never truly fading. Tom didn't want to believe it. He wanted to leave and never look back, to run far away from this place that had torn them apart. But Lena knew that the house wasn't finished with them. It had left its mark on them, deep, irreversible. And now, there was no escaping it. They weren't just leaving a house. They were leaving a part of themselves behind, a part of something that would follow them forever. The house may have fallen silent, but the whispers would never truly fade. The entity wasn't gone. It was still watching, still waiting from behind the walls. And no matter how far they ran, it would always be there. The last of their belongings were packed, the car loaded, and with one final glance, Lena and Tom stepped away from the house that had consumed their lives. The weight of it all pressed on them, the heavy burden of everything they'd endured, the whispers, the shadows, the terror of the entity lurking behind the walls. It was done, they told themselves. The house was behind them now, a nightmare they could finally leave behind. As they climbed into the car, the rain had stopped. The storm that had once raged so fiercely now just a memory. The road stretched out before them, empty, quiet. They were free. Tom started the engine, and with a deep breath, they pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house behind. But as the car made its way down the narrow road, the weight in Lena's chest didn't lift. She felt a strange emptiness settle over her, like something was missing, or worse, something was still there. The house loomed behind them, silent and imposing in the rearview mirror. It seemed to be watching them go, standing like a dark sentinel in the distance. Lena couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. She glanced back, her heart skipping a beat when her eyes landed on the window of the old house. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the upstairs window, she saw a figure, motionless, standing in the glass, waving slowly. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't Isabella. It wasn't a shadow or a ghostly apparition. It was her, Lena's own reflection, clear as day, standing in the window of the house, her hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. The motion was slow, almost mocking, as if it were a twisted echo of herself, a part of her still trapped in the walls of the house, still tethered to the place that had haunted her for so long. Her heart hammered in her chest, her stomach twisted with an icy dread that clung to her like a second skin. She turned quickly to Tom, her voice breaking, the panic rising in her throat. "Tom, stop the car! Stop the car now!" Tom glanced at her, confused by the urgency in her voice. "What? What's wrong?" Lena pointed to the rearview mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "The window! The window! Do you see it?" Tom looked back, his brow furrowed in confusion. But the window was empty now, the house nothing but a shadow against the darkening sky. "Lena, there's nothing there. You're just—" "No!" Lena interrupted, her voice rising in desperation. "I saw it. I saw my reflection. In the window, it was me." But Tom, ever the skeptic, turned his eyes back to the road, trying to calm her. "Lena, you're just— I swear to God, Tom." Her voice cracked with the weight of her fear. "It was me, waving. I saw it. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't anything. It was me. I was still in there." Tom's face shifted, uncertainty creeping in. He wanted to comfort her, but he couldn't ignore the raw fear in her eyes. He knew something had changed in her, something had broken in her during those last moments in the house. But this couldn't be real, could it? Lena couldn't tear her eyes away from the rearview mirror. The reflection, the image of herself, stayed in her mind like a dark stain she couldn't wash away. The house was gone, and yet it still had its grip on her. Something was wrong. So horribly wrong. The car sped away. But no matter how far they drove, the feeling didn't leave her. The unsettling weight of knowing, of feeling, that something or someone was still there. And somewhere, deep inside, Lena felt the suffocating certainty that no matter how far she ran, no matter how much time passed, the house would always be a part of her. That figure in the window? It was her, yes, but not in the way she thought. The house had never let her go, and no matter where she went, she would always be trapped behind its walls, watching, waiting. The reflection wasn't just a haunting from the house, it was a reflection of the truth, that she was never truly free. The house had claimed her, body and soul. And as the distance between the house and the car grew, Lena realized she hadn't escaped at all. It had followed her, and it always would. As Lena and Tom drove farther away from the house, the shadows of their past followed them like a dark cloud, and the unsettling reality of their situation weighed heavily on them. No matter where they went, the house's grip on them would never truly loosen. It wasn't just the walls that had trapped them. It was something deeper, something that would always haunt their reflections. Lena had thought they were free, but the house had found a way to make sure it would always remain with them. The reflection in the window wasn't just a warning, it was a reminder. Some things are never truly left behind. If you enjoyed this haunting tale and want to dive deeper into stories that will leave you questioning what's real, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Like the video if the chills ran down your spine, and drop a comment below to share your thoughts. Did you think the house had truly let them go? Or was something darker still watching them from the shadows? We'd love to hear your theories. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, you never know what might be watching from behind the walls.